Thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of the Center for Security Policy. I've been following their work for quite a long time, and I'm very happy to be here. I do a lot of work on both domestic and foreign policy issues, but I got my start as a journalist on the foreign policy front. I had exposed a professor at my school at Claremont McKenna, a notoriously conservative liberal arts school, and they had brought somebody by the name of Bassam Frangia who was saying one thing to West Side Jewish homes about peace in English, and then the next day giving interviews in Arabic about how the Jewish state should be destroyed and in support of Hamas and Hezbollah. So I caused a big fundraising problem for the school by translating his work, and I've been off to the races ever since. I think, if I may, kind of speak from experience, in the foreign policy side of things, we have a problem of getting our message out to the wider community. There are many things that we know to be true that the rest of the country does not know to be true because we have not done a good job of actually going out and building the coalitions necessary to actually win these issues. And I think part of the problem is obviously we have mainstream media bias. Obviously, they are not inclined to actually cover our issues. You see this most notoriously with Benghazi. But I think part of the problem is also with the right media, that we've spent a lot of time doing media criticism and not enough time doing media production. And that's something that I've tried to fix in my own work. I think what we're actually facing in many respects is a cold civil war. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, and I think our most important weapon in this cold civil war is credibility. And to my likes, there's no credibility without seeing, and no credibility without actually seeing the document, seeing the video, seeing the actual documentation. And I think we can never really shame the left-wing media into doing the job that it doesn't want to do. And the right-wing media, I don't think, will ever actually win. So I would say that we should seek not to replicate the media with its mirror bias, but we should seek to replace it by doing actually good work. And so what would help me, with a lot of you have very important information that needs to get out to the wider public, and what would help me is if you started thinking in terms of leads. A big problem I have is when I deal with people who are national security types, and forgive me if this applies to some of the people in this room, but they're especially verbose. They can't distill it down to a lead. I mean, even if you think in 140 characters, I mean, it'd be great if we could all write Proust, but we can't. We've got to get it short. We've got to get people's attention. And what I like to do when I do my research is I like to look for unguarded moments. The moments in which they're hot mics, the moments in which they're early parts of people's career. So for instance, when I published Susan Rice's pro-Robert Mugabe dissertation earlier this year, I went back and I found out that she was a Rhodes Scholar. I then had somebody go to the Rhodes Scholar place and digitize all of the important dissertations that are there. And then the next most important thing of all this is the timing, right? You cannot, with a lot of this work, you cannot win if the other side is controlling the parameters of the debate. So for instance, what I like to do is I like to look for video, for archives, for dissertations, for early moments in people's career. This is actually very helpful. Like when I published now CIA Director Brennan's dissertation about how too much freedom is possible, the problems of, he was very pro basically censorship and dictatorship. When I published that, it was, we published the entire dissertation and then we took from that the relevant bits to kind of cause trouble. This can be done on many different levels. This can be done all over the place. And what I like to do with my research is, you mentioned that I work for two competing sites, the Blaze and the Daily Caller. What I do with them is I have a deal where I get a percentage of the traffic, so I can have a feedback from the actual community. I mean, there's a lot of very good research that the national security community does, but they don't know if it's actually being read. And so I can actually see from my traffic how much, who's reading what, and actually arrange my work accordingly. And so I've had hits like I worked on the Robert Menendez story, which of course there's still more to come out on that. I've just been kind of busy selling my book on Calvin Coolidge, so I apologize. But there are all kinds of ways that we can get these stories out to a wider audience, and it's all about the timing, and it's all about getting picked up larger. Kind of moving along, I did the Hagel front group with Iran stuff, which was a lot of fun. did the Code Pink, met with our acting ambassador with Pakistan, and he described drone policy to the Code Pinkers. And there's actual video of that, and I took that. So, I mean, I don't really want to, I mean, I could talk about some of the other stuff that I found, some stuff I'm still working on, but I'd kind of be more interested in kind of if there are any questions or anything, that we can go from there.
All right, thanks, thanks, Charles. Let me just start with something you just mentioned about trying to be more active. Obviously, one of the, I think, most glaring examples of the establishment media not paying attention to detail or facts or the truth, for that matter, is the whole lack of coverage on Benghazi.
Sure, sure.
How should that have been handled by alternative media and in conjunction with think tanks, many of which are around this table?
Sure.
How could you and colleagues here have made that a story that would capture the conscience of the country at large and not just a few enclaves here and there?
Well, it's surprising to me that even today we don't know the names of the Benghazi survivors. We don't even know if they were contractors. It's surprising. I mean, there's a lot of sort of unanswered questions here. We don't know the timeline really. We know bits and pieces of the timeline. I think the problem that the right was hoping for is they were hoping that this would be a silver bullet to take out Barack Obama. That would finally, be the gun that we could, the bullet for the gun that we could use to actually make it like Carter in 1970, 1979, 1980 all over again. It didn't quite work out that way. And part of the reason I think it didn't work out is that we on the right and the right media spend a lot of time criticizing the coverage or the lack of coverage rather than supplying our own. I think there is an appetite for it today. I found out just recently, I heard back from the filmmaker, the guy who made the Innocence of Muslims film. He's in a federal prison. I finally tracked him down in a federal prison in Anthony, Texas. And one thing I want to go do is, and I'm raising money for us to go out and actually go and interview him on camera in the federal prison. Because obviously this allegedly started with a video. Let's hear what he actually has to say. We actually allowed the New York Times to dominate this issue because they're the only ones who've ever even interviewed him, and of course they have their attendant biases. So I think what we could do, I mean, another good example is if we go to things like the Hagel nomination. Obviously, I think the right messed up terribly. My old friend Ben Shapiro with the Friends of Hamas moment. I had a whole slew of information that I was going to present on Hagel, which of course was all useless because we've got to get our facts right. And I think this is something that we've got to think. I have a thing I call the grandma test, right? My grandmother's an 89-year-old woman. She's a political liberal, and she watches about 2 or 3 channels, neither of which I watch or care to even sit down and watch. But if she I try and think about how can I present something in such a way that she can actually understand it. And I think the problem with, say, like the Benghazi thing is we didn't have a narrative that was succinct and clear. And had we worked more on getting the information out there, I think we could have done a better job. Same thing with Hagel as well.
Is there, just to follow up for a minute, because I'm sure you're aware there is now an initiative, of course, that this center has been working on, that Congressman Wolf has been trying to get special investigation committee for Benghazi. The Speaker of the House is essentially sitting on that. That's his call. What is the most effective way to use the tools at your disposal to bring that into full sunlight and perhaps get some results and answer some of the questions that you started your comments by addressing?
That's right. I mean, I always love leaks, so of course, anyone here could supply them. But I think the trick with a lot of this stuff is the right has a very, we file a FOIA or we do an investigation. We have a very, we're playing sort of a defensive position, right? What we should be doing is I'm told one of the things I've heard, and I've not confirmed this yet, I've been working on trying to confirm this, is that the survivors are actually contractors. They're not in fact, they're worried about losing their contract with the government, and that's why they're not coming forward. Now, if I were the Darrell Ices of the world, I would say to them, or the Frank Wolfs of the world, I would say, well, do you want to be a source or do you want to be a target, right? And that's how I would approach the issue. Instead, we can file FOIAs, we can have, committee hearings, all of which are important, but we've kind of already, I think, lost when we get to that stage. Just kind of, a good example of that most recently is we had the hearings on, of course, which were important on the Muslim Brotherhood involvement, but the other side was prepared for all of this. And had we been, had we gone and prepared the journalistic background, backgrounds and all this stuff, had we actually gotten the material out, say, 6 months, a year ahead of time to prepare who these people were, to get the bloggers, the others actually out and interested on this, could have been a bit more effective, I think.
Yes, right here, Charles. Wait for the microphone so everybody can hear you.
Hi, George Nicholson. One of the things that bothers me, and a very close friend of mine is one of the best commentators out there, Kim Dozier, as you're all probably all aware of. What Stan McChrystal, for instance, has said now, that, and people tried to draw him out of what happened with his Rolling Stones interview, and he said, what we have to realize how things have changed today is everybody's a journalist. You've got Twitter,
Sure.
You've got blogs, and everything else. And what people are more interested in is sensationalism, just like what happened to General John Allen, the hullabaloo about his emails to Jill Kelly. It turns out, fact, every one of those emails he sent out, he CC'd his own wife on it. I certainly haven't seen anything in the press about that.
Sure. Well, I'd love to see the evidence for it. I mean, I'll print that. That seems fun. I mean, one thing I would say is that, in a perfect world, we'd be able to get the Anthony Weiners of the world on, corruption, or Elliot Spitzer we'd be able to get on, use of the state troopers. Instead, we have to rely on sex scandals. And, I wish that it were other. I mean, I tend to be a pretty clean living guy, and it kind of grosses me out to go through all of the prostitutes that are that Senator Menendez was allegedly using. I wish that it were other, but we do have a climate that believes in sensationalism, and the way I try to think about it is how do we get them to take the medicine with the cheese, right? How do we get the spoonful of sugar to have the medicine go down and actually get the ideas that are important? And it's a trick. I mean, the trick I think most of all is timing. If you get the timing of the story just right, I mean, every story needs a peg. And if it doesn't have that, it often gets lost. And I've seen it with stories that I'm particularly interested in. But yeah, I mean, we do live in a world in which everyone has a camera, everyone has a cell phone camera. I use Twitter as a surveillance tool. Like one thing I'll notice is if say a campaign office goes dark, it usually means that there's going to be some big shakeup. There are all sorts of ways that you can actually get, many of the people who send me things. One of the guys I work with all the time who actually helped me find the Code Pink video is a database programmer who works out of Orange County and just, finds things and sends them to me. So you can never know when things are going to actually come to you, and you've got to be much more receptive to potential leaks that way. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
It's just a change in journalism. I'd like to see I think Connie Chung used to be an excellent journalist. Maury Povich used to be an excellent journalism. Right now, they're just trash journalists on TV.
Yeah, I mean, you see this with like CNN, for instance, back in the day. This used to be, this is CNN, right? That was there, and now a lot of their television has become a lot more reality TV based, and it's sort of like the high establishment has become very low, and what I'm trying to do, what others like me are trying to do, like with the Hagel stuff, there are basically only like 5 or so actual journalists. They're all in their 20s that were actually going and doing the stuff at the Washington Free Beacon and elsewhere. What I'm trying to do is build out the ranks of amateur people and actually get them so that we actually have leads, so we actually have standards of our reporting, which I think will be, there's all that stuff can, I think, be taught, but right now we're sort of in an amateur moment.
But
for better or for
to
worse.
George's point, really, the pressure on young people getting into this business is to succeed at being an infotainer, really, more than an journalist. What you're talking about is almost a lost art, it seems, and certainly not a very remunerative one.
Well, what I try to explain to a lot of the people who are young who want to go into journalism is everybody wants to go into opinion journalism, which I think is just a terrible, terrible thing to do because there's, nobody needs a lot of 20-somethings spouting off their opinions. What they need actual evidence. They need actual documents. What I like to do is find the document that people say shouldn't exist that does exist, right? Or the video that shouldn't exist but is there. Because that disrupts a narrative and then you can form something entirely new on that. And I think if I were advising kind of younger people who actually do this type of, to do investigative stuff, is start at the college campuses. I mean, many of the professors there, many of the speakers that come there, they think they're in a comfortable environment. You can, in some states you can record them, obviously check your local laws, don't do anything criminal. But in many, that's how you can kind of get your start actually producing news. And it's a lot more fun too, I would say.
Yes. Did did you have a question?
Yep.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I really endorse the idea of going and reading the documents and finding new material. And of course, I would say that because I'm a researcher, and nothing researchers like more than praise for researchers. But there is a paradoxical element here that I, for example, last summer got a leak from the UN. One of their internal reports on firearms, which sort of called the idea of firearms ownership a gendered mistake, and said that you should be against it because you should be against masculinity. Okay. Yeah. Nice long UN paper on the subject. Well, when you put it out there, the response you get, and I understand why people do this, but the response you get is literally that doesn't exist and the words on the paper have no meaning. So,
yeah.
I love the call for research and documents, but people shouldn't kid themselves that just because they pull out a great piece of paper that's incredibly embarrassing, that it's going to turn people around, because there is an incredible ability people have just to sort of dismiss the actual piece of paper which you've managed to procure.
No, I mean, fair enough. I mean, I've seen this more often than not, where people will deny an actual photograph. They'll say, oh, this is photoshopped, or this is what have you. I mean, obviously, the people who are on the right doing investigative work, they have to have their credibility airtight in a way. I mean, they have to have a triple standard. And it's entirely unfair, but it's entirely the way it is. And so what I would say is that most stories should be short. I mean, you shouldn't have more than 800 words, and every story should have a picture or a video or something. And if you had that, that craziness, you could say, hey, here it is, or here it is on your screen. Seeing really is believing. And if you do this enough times, you can actually be surprised at how you can persuade people. And of course, you have a humor element too, which is, which people like. People like that a lot more than say, here's this dry paper that, so.
There was a question down here, I know.
Yeah, you mentioned making sure your recordings are legally obtained. What happens when two Progress Kentucky staffers illegally record something and Slate runs it anyway? Is there some sort of an ethical standard there?
Well, one thing I would say is that I can't go into the details on this, but one of those staffers has a long criminal history, and you should read all about it in the Daily Caller on Monday. So what I could say is that, yeah, I mean, you're gonna live in a world in which you have the Scott Proudies on the one hand, the 47% comment types, where he did exactly what James O'Keefe has done, right, on the right, and yet James O'Keefe was in federal probation for 3 years, and he, and Scott Proudy gets to be on MSNBC and gets to be a liberal, So yes, there are ethical limits, I think, that people should impose on themselves. I mean, for instance, I don't go after people's children unless the children become like a big part of the story. The other side does not have those restrictions, as you can see with the Sarah Palin, the way they treated her kids. But yeah, there are. I think there should be ethical limits. I think that's something that the profession should discuss and police its own ranks. But yeah, I mean, we live in a world in which the Pentagon Papers happen. I mean, if you have documents that are illegally obtained, so long as you're not paying for it. I mean, on the one hand, I'd love to live in a world in which the people who do the WikiLeaks of the world were actually executed as traitors. But on the other hand, that's not the world we live in. I wish there were other. But if the WikiLeaks stuff comes out, and it's interesting, as a journalist, it's my duty to actually, cover it and actually make it of use to the audience. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yes, David.
Can you elaborate on, 2 points that you covered briefly? Number one is your working method.
Sure.
And number two is what people maybe in this room or in Washington in general, at think tanks on the Hill, can do to even start thinking about how to weaponize some of this information that they have.
Well, one thing I would say is that every story needs a who. And so what I'll do is I have a list of about 250 people that I track at all times. So I'll have Google News alerts on them. If there are events in my area and I live in LA, I'll go to them. If I have friends who are in the DC, New York area and they're speaking, I'll have them go to them. And you'll just record them. And sooner or later, they will have an unguarded moment. And sooner or later, that's when you can actually be of use. When somebody makes the news, like for instance, when Susan Rice was making the news, there's this program called WorldCat, which has a list of everything she's ever written or been involved with, worldcat.org. And you go to that and you can pull up her whole history. And so I found her pro-Robert Mugabe dissertation. You can do that with a lot of things, and that's a good way for people who are researchers who aren't necessarily inclined to go out and actually, go into the field or go into the archives. That's one way that they can actually be, useful. You can get a lot of stuff with a library card and a lot of help from good librarians.
Charles,
So,
thank
thank
you.
you, thank you,
I
Fred.
want to move along.